Even the best trained dogs in the world do not work for nothing. Those dogs are still working for rewards. But the trainers have made the dog believe that if they just keep going, they do one more rep, they push harder, they go further, as long as they keep going, eventually they'll get their food, or they'll get their tug, or they'll get their ball, whatever. If you've been following my channel for any length of time, I'm sure you've noticed that I like to use a lot of positive reinforcement in my training process. Because of that, I get asked fairly frequently, how do I get a dog to listen to me even when the rewards are out of the picture? Or in other words, if I don't have any rewards on me, can I still get a dog to pay attention to me and to listen to me? Or sometimes someone will bring up a concern that goes along the lines of, I don't want to have to bribe my dog in order for them to listen to me. My dog should just do what I told them to do because I told them to do it. And honestly, I think that's a good question and a fair concern to have, because even for me, I don't feel like a dog is completely trained until I can get them to listen to me even when I don't have rewards on me. And yet, even though I use positive reinforcement for probably 95%, if not more, of my training process, at the end of it all, I can still get dogs to listen to me whether I have a reinforcement on me or not. So if that's the case, what's the secret? How do I do it? Well, the secret, like a lot of things in dog training, is that it's not just one thing. It's actually a combination of things that come together to create that picture. This is very similar to a video I did on how to get a dog's attention no matter what. There's a handful of things that come together to create that picture, and in the same way, this is exactly the same thing, except it's a different topic and with a different set of components. And I get asked that question frequently enough that I figured I'd make a video about it, to help people get a better understanding and a clearer overview of what goes into that process. So let's not waste any more time. Let's just get into it. Before I get into the more specific techniques that I like to use to get a dog to mind me whether I have a reward or not, I want to go over a very fundamental concept in dog training that I feel everyone should know, but from experience, I know it's something that a lot of people don't, if not most people don't. So I want to touch on that real quick because this concept is extremely important to this topic as a whole as well. So everyone needs to know it. First off, what you need to understand is that dogs do what works for them. Or to put it another way, dogs only do things if they have a reason to do it. To put it even more specifically, this just means that something in the dog's environment or their instincts or something or someone has to give a dog a reason to do the things that they do. Dogs don't do things for no reason. They have to have a reason to do it before they do it. Essentially, what we're talking about here is motivation, or maybe more specifically, the creation of motivation. And there are really only two ways to create motivation in a dog, or people for that matter. And that's through either the promise of acquiring something they want or need, or the administering or relief of some unpleasant experience that they can't avoid. So let's make a hypothetical situation. Let's say I'm going to offer you $1 million to paint my house. If you want or need $1 million to paint my house, you'll paint my house. Or my other approach could be to threaten to do something unpleasant to you if you don't paint my house. And if you find that unpleasant thing to be truly aversive and you have no way to avoid it, you will paint my house. If the result is the same, why does it matter which one I use? What's the difference? The difference is the association you will create to me. Or put another way, it changes the way you view me, and thus the relationship between us. In the $1 million instance, you'll see me as a generous provider. In the threatening instance, you'll see me as someone to fear and avoid. And in the same way, if your dog's experiences with you are predominantly unpleasant, then they're going to view you as someone to fear and avoid when they can. So all that may seem pretty obvious. I feel like a lot of people probably understand that. But the part of this that I feel many people miss is that if you are not using positive reinforcement, then by default, you're using aversion or unpleasant experiences to motivate your dog. This is because there are only 4 quadrants in operant conditioning. And of those 4 quadrants, positive reinforcement is the only one that doesn't use some form of aversion in some way. Negative reinforcement turns off an aversive experience, and before you can turn off an aversive experience, you have to first have an aversive experience. Positive punishment administers an aversive experience, and negative punishment removes something pleasant to create an aversive experience. So what all this means is that if you're not using positive reinforcement to teach and motivate your dog, then you're likely using a lot more aversion than you may realize, which will then, of course, cause your dog to create an unpleasant association to you, which will then negatively impact the relationship you have with the dog. One of the key components to getting a dog to listen to you, no matter what's going on around them or no matter what you have on you, is to create a very solid relationship with them based on respect. And a mistake that many people make is they confuse fear for respect. They confuse suppression with training. You cannot demand respect. You have to earn it through action. This is just as true for human-to-human relationships as it is for human to canine. And yet, for some reason, human nature has a tendency to keep us from seeing that. And unfortunately, the dogs are the ones that ultimately end up paying the price for it. Talking about what goes into building a respectful relationship with a dog could be an entire video in and of itself. And maybe one day I'll get around to making it. But for now, know that getting respect from a dog comes from a combination of spending quality time with them, providing access to resources, mostly positive training experiences, and setting boundaries. All right, now that we got all that out of the way, let's go over some more specific techniques that are used to get a dog to pay attention to you, whether you have rewards or not. This first one I feel should be pretty obvious to a lot of people, but it turns out it's not. And what it is, simply put, is just making sure you get enough reps in, so the dog gets enough practice doing that behavior, to the point where the behavior becomes a reflex. It's no longer a decision. It's a reflex. It's a conditioned response to your command word. And the only way to get a dog to that point is to get a lot of reps in, and to get a lot of reps in many different environments and in many different situations. It's kind of like us, even whenever we are learning a new skill. At first, we have to really think about what we're doing in order to do the thing we're learning, but eventually you do that enough times and you can do that skill without thinking about it anymore. You can be on autopilot and you're doing that skill. Kind of like driving. If you imagine the first time you drove, you're probably like really thinking about everything, looking in the mirrors all the time, making sure you're doing everything right. You're being very conscious about all the decisions you're making. But I know now for a lot of people, you space out when you drive. And you're like, whoa, how did I get here? Yeah, you're on autopilot, right? Because you've done it so many times. That's ultimately where you want your dog to get to with their commands. This next technique is one that's maybe not as obvious, but it is still very simple to implement. And what it is just hiding rewards on you. So instead of having a treat pouch visible, externally, or you're holding food in your hands, or you've got a food bowl next to you that you're pulling food from, instead of doing that, have some food in a Ziploc bag and put it in a pocket. And don't reach for that food until you're ready to reinforce them. Now, of course, a lot of dogs will still smell the food on you, but that's where getting a lot of reps comes in. And then also this next topic I'm going to talk about here in a second. Or something else you could do if you still want to use a treat pouch is you could just wear the treat pouch on you all the time, so that the visual of the treat pouch doesn't accidentally get associated to training time only. So for example, if you only get the treat pouch out and put it on you when it's time to train, well then the dog's going to know when it's training time and whenever I can do whatever I want time. So if you still want to use a training pouch, that's fine. Just make sure that you don't just put it on when you're training and take it off as soon as you're done training. Maybe walk around with it all the time. Maybe walk around with it and always having food in it, so even the smell of food doesn't really mean anything to them. That's another way to go about it. This is just break up the context, break up the associations around any training equipment you may use in that way. And this last technique is one that's a little bit more advanced and maybe doesn't get talked about nearly as often, especially in pet dog circles. But what it is changing what's called a dog's reinforcement schedule. When you first start training a dog, you always start with the continuous reinforcement schedule. And the continuous reinforcement schedule is whenever you reward the dog every time they're successful in whatever it is you're teaching them. Every time they do what you wanted them to do, you reinforce them every single time. This is crazy important, vitally important for the effectiveness of both the variable and random reinforcement schedules that come later on. And that's why in the beginning, it seems like we're using a lot of reinforcements. We're using a lot of food, a lot of rewards, because we are. We're doing that on purpose. Because what we're doing is we're building the expectation of reward. Because it's that expectation of reward that will carry us through the variable and random reinforcement schedules later. So something I want to get through everyone's thick skulls, because I know many people struggle with this idea, is that even the best trained dogs in the world do not work for nothing. And yes, I'm talking about the best trained dogs in the world. Those dogs are still working for rewards. But the trainers have made the dog believe that if they just keep going, they do one more rep, they push harder, they go further, as long as they keep going, eventually they'll get their food, or they'll get their tug, or they'll get their ball, whatever. And the trainers do this through changing up the dog's reinforcement schedules. So you start off with continuous reinforcement, which is reinforcing the dog every time. And then you move on to variable reinforcement, which is when you set a certain interval between reinforcements. So let's just take a simple sit, for example. If the dog sits, maybe that first rep, you reinforce them, you reward them. You ask them to do it again. This time you don't. The third time you do. The fourth time you don't. The fifth time you do. So we're on an every other repetition reinforcement schedule, right? Then maybe 2 in between, 3 in between, 4 in between, 5 in between. You can build it up as long as you want to. You can do this not only with the number of reps, but you can do this with time. So if you need a dog to hold a stay for a certain amount of time, at first you're reinforcing them all the time. As long as you're staying there, you're like constantly throwing food at them. But then maybe every other second, every other 5 seconds, every 10 seconds, something like that. Or if you're healing, in the beginning, it might just be taking one step, then maybe every third step, every 10th step, and you can build it from there. That's a variable reinforcement schedule. And once the dog has a good idea of a variable reinforcement schedule, they understand that pretty well, and they know to stay in it. They just stay in there long enough, they're going to get a reinforcement. Then you move on to a random reinforcement schedule, which is the same idea as the variable reinforcement schedule, except it is completely random. Sometimes they get reinforced right away. Other times they don't get reinforced for way down the road. And so the dog never knows when the reward is coming. They just know if they keep doing the behavior, or they keep doing what's asked of them, eventually the reward will be provided. So there you go, guys. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it gave you a better overview as to what goes into getting a dog to pay attention to you, whether you have a reward on you or not. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments as always. Good luck with your training, have fun with it, and I'll see you in the next one.